Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast brought to you by Arihanta Institute. I am your host for today, Jonathan Dickstein. I am professor at Arihanta Institute and also the lead organizer for our Vegan Studies initiative. Today, I am extremely excited to be here with Pratt professor and Vox writer, Dr. Jan Dutkiewicz, who's going to speak with us about a number of issues and also his upcoming class for Arihanta, Feeding the World Toward a Plant-Based Food System. Thank you for joining us, Jan.
Thanks for having me.
So let's dive right in. As a professor at Arihanta Institute, as someone who was brought up in this country and I study Jain studies and South Asian studies, I'm often asked how I came to what I study. How we usually get to our areas of study is not in a straight line, kind of a circuitous route. Whether I'm talking about Jain studies, South Asian studies, animal studies, or vegan studies. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to your own work about animals and food systems?
I think my path was also circuitous. I was born in Poland. I grew up all over the place. My undergrad is in business and econ and French. And I think I really didn't have much of a food systems or animal consciousness until during my undergrad, just becoming interested in the question of animal treatment. I came to the animal question through ethics, through the work of people like Peter Singer. So sort of Western utilitarian philosophy, which resonated with me at the time. And I think I'm completely not unique in that sense. I think a lot of people who came up in Canada and the US at that time came to animal issues through the work of people like Peter Singer or Tom Regan. Then I became more interested and a little bit active as a volunteer in environmental issues and wild animal protection. I did some onshore volunteering with Sea Shepherd, so not on the ship, but onshore. When it came time to sort of decide what I wanted to do, I was working in journalism, but thinking of coming back to academia. When I was thinking about what it was that I wanted to study, I thought at first that I wanted to focus on the question of the political economy of wild animal use. So the political economy of things like whaling or open sea fisheries, which would sort of combine my interest in wild species protection and my background in business and econ. So looking at the political economy of these things. But then when it came time to actually do my PhD, I don't know. I think I'm someone who does better studying things and analyzing things that are very immediate to me. And I think that comes from a background working in journalism. I don't like thinking about abstract things or writing about things in which I'm not immediately situated. And so, of course, I'm not in Japan. I'm not in Antarctica. I'm not close to sites of offshore fisheries. I would feel like perhaps too much of a dilettante to study those spaces. Whereas just I did my grad studies in New York City. So living in a major metropolis that consumes 20 billion pounds of food every year, I really started wondering about the systems that enable animal consumption to be so ubiquitous, so cheap, so socially normalized. So I think that in a sense, it was knowing I wanted to study the political economy of animal use because there was so much work already in philosophy and there just wasn't much work in political science on the question of animals. And so that was, in academic parlance, the research gap I wanted to address. And I wanted to work on something that was very immediate and tangible to my lived experience. And that was the consumption of primarily factory farmed animals. And that set off the past 10 years of my work. which has involved studying the environmental science, the politics and policy of factory farming, and also doing ethnographic work around factory farms, industrial slaughterhouses, but also places in that broader value chain like commodity brokerages. And so that's the background that brings me here.
Great. Actually, as you were talking, I was reminded of the piece we were speaking of before we started the podcast that was recently released by Astra Taylor and Sonora Taylor for Vox. And I say that because I was listening to this podcast and Astra Taylor was talking about how she also came into animal ethics, at least partially by way of Peter Singer, and that the two of them were commiserating a bit about this love-hate relationship with Peter Singer that almost everyone, I think of a certain generation specifically, has more and more. But part of the quote unquote hate relationship, I mean, there were other reasons as well, was the seemingly absence of political economy or a concern for it in Singer's work. So for our audience who are not really generally economists or maybe even political scientists, can you describe what you mean by political economy?
So the shortest definition I can give you is that political economy is the study of the imbrication of economic activity, so how and why things get produced, circulated, and purchased within the political and social systems within which they're embedded. So it's basically studying the relationship between society, political institutions and structures, and economic activity.
Yeah, and that seems, I think your interest from what you at least described or how you feel that your research has to take place, or at least focuses on where you exist in your place, in the situatedness, like you said, not something far off, not something purely abstract or philosophical. And right, political economy takes into account not just one's own, say, individual actions, but also like the entire system in which they live, their consumer activity, but also how much their consumer activity is dictated by broader economic and political forces and biases and motivations. Yeah, which I could just say, I guess, is why philosophy seems to, the kind of philosophy that a lot of people get involved in with animal ethics kind of seems to end at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there's a lot of merit to making philosophical arguments like Peter Singer does that are relatively, and I'm going to get back to this relatively, that are relatively abstracted from political economy, that are broad claims about, for instance, structures of prejudice that shape whose interests count and whose interests don't count, which is the basis of Peter Singer's argument in Animal Liberation, of course, that animals have interests, not necessarily the same interests as humans, but a core set of interests that are shared across species, such as the interest in being free from harm, and that humans ignore these animals' interests because of speciesism, which is a prejudice in favor of the interests of their own species. And I think that that's a very valid argument, right? But then the question becomes, how is speciesism enacted and why, right? And in what contexts? And I think political economic approach can start addressing that, right? So, which is, for instance, like the question is, why do people eat so much meat? Sure, it may be in part because of speciesism, but it may be that people eat a lot of meat because a lot of meat is produced. A lot of meat is produced because of the existence of factory farming. Factory farming is made possible because of a grain and oilseed complex. So, corn, soy, oil seeds that allow for the mass scale feeding of animals in factory farms. That in turn is supported by a set of laws that allow what goes on in factory farms to be legal. Those economies of scale allow for cheap prices, and those cheap prices, coupled with the economies of scale production, allow for a ubiquity of meat to be available. So by the time the average consumer encounters meat, like encounters that $4.99 Costco rotisserie chicken, sure, they may be eating an animal because of speciesism or because of not considering animals' interests, but their choices are also massively swayed by the ready availability and social normalization of meat, which is made possible through a series of sort of political and economic structures and decisions that themselves aren't explicitly motivated by speciesism, but are motivated by basic economic interests, right?
Yeah, thank you. That's, I think, really illuminating. And I think for a lot of individuals who are used to just thinking in this very much, say, principled approach to animal ethics, or this notion that we have certain beliefs and those will guide our behaviors, seems to be a bit myopic, or at least one-sided. So political economy fills in this larger picture that is largely this kind of social driver of our decisions on a daily basis. So I guess with that in mind, perhaps we could pivot to some of the work you're involved in currently under production and ongoing. I know that you teach at Pratt, and perhaps we can get into some of that. But at first, can you talk a little bit about this book project, this co-authored book project that you're putting together at the moment, and how that ties into this notion of political economy and how we might shift from, say, meatified food systems to unmeatified food systems?
I'm writing a book for Basic Books with Gabriel Rosenberg, who's a professor at Duke. The book is provisionally titled Feed the People. And the aim of the book is to imagine what a more just and sustainable food system in the United States could look like. And so what the book does is it explains, first of all, what a food system is, explains what's wrong with the current American food system, but where I think we immediately deviate from a lot of food writing, so from, work like Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan, or the work of Wendell Berry, or what have you, is rather than saying, look, the food system is quote unquote broken, and therefore we need to jettison it and start again, which, given the complexity of the food system, I think is a very simplistic and quite nonsensical claim. We say, all right, let's analyze what works and what doesn't, for whom and where in the food system. Because I think ultimately the modern food system has a lot of benefits, right? It's tremendously efficient. Food is safe. Food is readily available. Food is quite cheap. It's a system that lends itself to things like large-scale food aid through things like the food stamps program in the United States. So the things like scale and efficiency, we want to keep. We think those are fundamentally good things about the system. But then, of course, there are things we want to jettison, such as the inefficiency of, for instance, producing a lot of crops to feed to animals or to create ethanol fuels, which is a waste of land, it's a waste of water, right? We think that the environmental harms and the harms to animals, and also the harms to labor caused by industrial animal farms and industrial animal slaughterhouses, are a blight on the food system and are unnecessary, right? They're fundamentally unnecessary to feeding the United States a healthy, nutritious diet. We also look quite a bit at labor, because we think that for all the benefits of the modern food system, one of the things that really falls through the cracks is concern for labor, right? Like COVID happens, everyone's talking about essential workers working in the food system. But at the end of the day, workers in the food system in the United States are among the worst paid workers working the most dangerous jobs, be it people, picking berries in the hot sun in the summer in California or Texas, be it people working at slaughterhouses, be it people, waitresses working at a Waffle House in a state like Georgia that has no fixed minimum wage, right? Who are basically working off tips. And so we think that this has to be addressed. So what the book aims to do is present a progressive vision that works for eaters, that works for the environment, that works for animals, and that works for food labor, and asking how we can get there from our contemporary food system.
That seems like a great contribution to the literature. And I suppose, given the things you described, such as the perils of slaughterhouse work, such as the inefficiency when it comes to land and water, when it comes to, say, caloric inefficiencies and even feeding populations, can you maybe color in a little bit about what do you think drives, not really even philosophically, what do you think is like kind of driving this continual doubling down on an animal inputted food system in these ways? And if you want to give examples, and you spoke earlier about the kind of grain and oil and the kind of subsidies, I guess I'm more asking about what are these main forces in play that continually drive a system that so much literature that seems to be coming out is expressing its inefficiencies. And like I've heard you speak before, it's just like a researcher, it's just plain high costs, low efficiency. What do you think are some of the drivers of this continual reinforcement of that system?
I mean, the easy answer is that there is a meat industry, which is extremely large, which makes its money this way. This meat industry is a major buyer of crops like corn and soy, and therefore supports agriculture in large swaths of the country. Not only are they active economically and just producing this sort of world historical superabundance of cheap meat, but they're also very active politically. They're active politically in pushing against regulation or for deregulation, be it of things like water quality in Iowa, be it of things like pushing for faster line speeds at slaughterhouses to the detriment of workers, be it pushing for a reduction of federal USDA oversight at slaughterhouses, through to pushing for things like ag gag laws, which are anti-whistleblower laws that would prevent whistleblowing about animal mistreatment or worker mistreatment at plants. So, and simultaneously, these interests, so be it meat companies, farmers, commodity checkoff groups, so the sort of groups that producers pay some of their income into that then sort of lobby and advertise on behalf of a given commodity. So for instance, be it the Cattlemen's Association, the Pork Board, the dairy producers, so the makers of the famous Got Milk ad. These people are not only advertising these commodities, but they're directly lobbying legislators, right? Including, of course, politicians in farm states, but also the type of politicians who would be in the cabinet at the USDA and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work behind the scenes that goes into preventing the industry from treating animals better, treating labor better, treating the environment better. And then the final piece, which is unavoidable, is consumers, right? Consumers, the industry doesn't exist without someone who buys their products. And consumers are extremely complicit in this. I mean, the average American eats well over 200 pounds of meat every single year. And I think eating that much meat is made really accessible and really easy and really appealing by an industry that provides lots of cheap meat and advertises it a lot. We also can't let consumers off the hook, right? Because consumers in the United States live in a country with an incredible amount of choice when it comes to what food they eat. And people do vote with their fork, even if their choices are heavily swayed by advertising, by social norms, by price. Nonetheless, people opt to have meat very frequently. And so people voting with their fork 3 times a day keep the meat industry in business and extremely profitable.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think there's ways also that probably for a different conversation, we could discuss about how much individuals' consumption patterns, right? At least I think this way, are really not, right, just dictated by things such as taste, accessibility, and price points, for example, but also how much, right, advertisers use products of all sorts. I mean, we could go well beyond animal products to both cultivate and placate certain kinds of gendered or racial stereotypes of how one should act or what kind of identity construction. And so when people are voting with their forks, they're oftentimes voting to maintain certain kinds of norms of who they are. And right, these advertising campaigns, whether it's about being real men or whether it's about being a kind of sexually virile man by consuming meat, right? There's so much literature, so much feminist literature on this. We can see how much consumers, are very much involved in this, and hence why, right, there is so much resistance. Almost that, right, the giving up the meat resistance is like the giving up guns, being pried from your cold dead hands is almost the same kind of feeling. In that vein, you have this book coming out, but I've also noticed recently that over at Vox, where you are a contributor, there's a lot of content coming out. As I said recently, there's a piece by Astra and Sonara Taylor. Also, Jishnu Guha came out with a piece on veganism. So I'm just curious, could you talk a little bit about what's going on over at Vox and their content regarding animals, food systems, veganism, and what you are contributing at the moment?
I mean, I can't speak to the high level editorial logics, but I think that Vox is with a sort of like respectful tip of the hat to The Guardian, which is of course British, but I think Vox is the only major US publication that treats food systems and factory farming as the major political and environmental and social issues that they are. And I think that what they've seen is that when they do good, in-depth, honest coverage of these issues, that there's a wide readership who's hungry, if you will, for this coverage. Because it's not that people don't care, it's that people don't know about a lot of these things, right? I think Vox is doing a tremendous public service by dedicating resources to coverage of different aspects of food systems and specifically of factory farming. And I think it's only so glaringly visible because other outlets don't do it, right? Or don't do it enough. If we're looking at the scale of the problem presented by the sort of negative parts, if you will, like the most externality producing parts of the food system, and by factory farming and industrial animal agriculture, right? Of everything we talked about. So in terms of harms to animals, harms to the environment, harms to labor, increasing the risk of zoonotic disease. This should be something that's covered all the time, right? Like it's by far the most deleterious part of the entire food system. And it's like the fact that it's not covered, I think, is an indictment of most media. I think that's how I would frame that. And I think what Vox is doing is extremely praiseworthy, and I'm really happy they're doing it. And I'm so happy to be able to contribute to those efforts. And I know from working inside that process that it's, there are a lot of resources that go into it. These are often long pieces that are meticulously fact-checked, well reported. Each one is sort of like months and months of work by large teams. And so I'm glad that they're being read. I'm glad they're getting put out. But I think that, yeah, as I said, I think it's visible because other media aren't covering it. And I think other media should. I think people should be covering factory farming the same way they covered tobacco, right? When it was shown that tobacco was directly linked to cancer, both through smoking and through secondhand smoke, I think they should be covering factory farming the same way they cover oil. And I just think we're not there yet.
Yeah, we recently had a conversation with Vasile Stanescu, who's doing a course for us on greenwashing and humane washing in animal agriculture. In one of the Q&A sessions, we were talking a bit about how, right, or he was discussing how animal agriculture, right, is just following this kind of standard playbook that you saw with asbestos and you saw with tobacco, right, of ways to present kind of the industry in ways that are clearly inaccurate or misleading or blatantly dishonest. And we start to see, right, with drivers of climate change or the welfare of animals, right? There's campaigns right now, I know in the UK about the RSPCA and certain humane standards, and then people going into farms and showing how they're just like not even remotely close to anything that these standards would project. And that there's a certain point in which that will fail. Now the question is, how you alluded to earlier, how big these systems are, both politically, economically, in our psyche. And so that's a lot of the resistance, maybe why media outlets just certainly aren't highlighting them, because they just don't have so much popular appeal, just as probably when banning tobacco was the case. So I suppose you're saying at The Guardian, right, supplies a lot of information in the UK, and Vox is doing so. So I don't know if you're allowed to speak to things that you're working on, or what are like the kind of things that you're tasked with as a contributor there.
I write long form pieces about sort of underreported but large scale issues in the food system. So most recently, I wrote a very long feature about PETA and the influence of PETA on the modern animal rights movement. I've written about the drivers behind the European farmers' protests that sort of shook Europe this spring. I've written about, speaking of greenwashing, and I've written about the New York State false advertising lawsuit against JBS, the world's biggest meat producer, about their emissions reductions claims. So, I could talk about any of those or not, but this is the sort of work I do. So sort of large pieces, really delving into, I think, important things happening in the food system, but in a way that isn't just daily news coverage, but in a way that provides a sort of deeper historical and social and policy analysis of the antecedents and effects of these major things that are happening. I can't speak about what I'm working on next, but I'm working on another piece that similarly, I mean, in this case, that'll deal with a major global institution and how that institution sort of, despite itself, upholds the primacy of animal agriculture.
Great, looking forward to it. And we'll surely share some of these other pieces with our audience as well, the ones that are out or published already. So you've been a speaker also in our Voices in Vegan Studies series at Arihanta. And also you and I have collaborated on a couple pieces regarding veganism. And so I suppose without maybe going through some of the kind of old heavy-handed discussions or overwrought discussions, I guess I'm curious where you think veganism kind of fits in this entire discussion. And we touched on earlier about how consumers are certainly at play here and are culpable. And we're also imagining a vastly different food system. So kind of how would you talk about where veganism fits in, or kind of things like almost veganism or mostly veganism, given certain, say, regional, cultural, and economic contexts? I say this because I think we have been struggling, and maybe this is part of your piece about PETA or any pieces about the history of animal rights movement, are the ways in which vegan discourse has perhaps been insensitively deployed or kind of universally employed, insensitive to context. So maybe if there's some way into that discussion of where you think it fits in this kind of, when we're talking about changing food systems and improvements for not just animals, but also human populations impacted by animal industries.
I'll start with this. Opinion polls of Americans regularly show that half or just over half of Americans favor banning factory farms, right? It's a quite consensus. Sorry, not consensus, it's a quite majority position. It's also something that comes up all the time in food writing across the spectrum, right? I would say that in food writing, it is a de facto consensus position. But we have to grapple with what that means. Like, let's say you could wave a magic wand and make factory farms disappear overnight. That would mean that the American meat supply would be deprived of 99% of chickens, 97% of pork, and if you count feedlots, 60-something% of all beef. So if we got rid of factory farms, most of the United States would be vegetarian, de facto, right? Vegetarian, mostly vegan, overnight. And that shows just to what extent our mass scale meat consumption is predicated on the existence of factory farming as a practice, right? So even if people don't live by their stated principles, I think that if people did, most people would eat far less meat. And the reason I start with that is because I think that ultimately, if we are to keep, I mean, and this is just speaking to the most recent peer-reviewed literature, if we are to keep agriculture within planetary limits in terms of land use, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, we need to massively reduce the amount of meat people eat, with numerous peer-reviewed studies coming out over the past few years showing that vegan diets are by far the least resource intensive or the most sustainable, if you will. And so somewhere at that intersection of what is at least a stated majority ethical position and what the peer-reviewed literature says, I think that something like veganism, or as close to veganism as possible, is, from a sort of environmental science point of view, from a public health point of view, but also from an ethical point of view, getting pretty close to an optimal diet. And the other thing I'll say on this, and this is why I stressed the consumer aspect of this earlier, right, is that unlike something like clean energy, where consumers just want to flick a switch and have the lights come on, and if it comes from renewable sources, all the better. When it comes to the food system, consumers have, it's a bounded and shaped agency, but nonetheless, there's a tremendous amount of agency there. And so we can't get away from factory farming or move towards a more sustainable food system until consumers are either willing to accept regulations and restrictions on their consumer habits, such as, for instance, like a carbon tax on meat or bans on particular types of products, or until they're willing to change their own consumer habits. And so I think food is one of the places where consumers have far more agency than in other parts of the economy. Right. So you can say you should drive an EV instead of a gas car. And I think, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm all pro EVs. I'm even more pro public transit. I'm even more pro public transit that uses EVs or thermal power. Right. But that's an ask, right? Asking someone to buy a different car is a large ask. Asking someone to buy an Impossible Burger instead of a burger, or to buy some tofu instead of chicken, of course, runs into problems. But I think that that's a choice that's within the ambit of everyday consumer agency. So, and at the end of the day, I think having people change their consumer habits, or change their consumer habits enough to be willing to accept policies that would shift consumer habits, such as, for instance, by making red meat more expensive because of a carbon tax, is necessary. I think it's, like, put differently, I think it's difficult to imagine, speaking here as a political scientist, large scale buy-in for policies that would restrict consumer decisions by consumers who are not willing to change their habits in the first place. What I'm basically saying is, if someone, if a number of people are willing to, buy less hamburgers, buy more Impossible Burgers, those same people would probably be more willing to accept something like a carbon tax that makes meat more expensive, rather than if those same people never change their consumer behavior in the first place and were then presented with an incoming carbon tax on meat, which would directly affect their consumer habits. And I think that in the latter case, they would be far more resistant as citizens and voters. Right. So I think what I'm saying is we need both. We need policy and regulatory and legislative change, but we also need consumer change.
Yeah, there's so much there. At first I was reminded, at least I'll speak to the kind of what you were saying at the end. I was reminded of, I want to say this is around 2002, 2003, when places like Philadelphia and New York City, right, were banning smoking inside bars and restaurants. And at the time, I admittedly was smoking cigarettes, and I remember speaking with friends and being in full support of this happening. Not just because anyone who smoked cigarettes at that time would know, you come home, everything smells like cigarettes, even for yourself. But also, I think there was this general understanding that for everybody else present, especially those who are not smoking cigarettes, like, this is the better call. Even in New York City in February, we can go outside. But until the ban was enacted, none of us stopped smoking cigarettes inside. None of us said, you know what, we're in full agreement with the law, but didn't feel impelled to follow it until it was enacted. And why I say that is, I remember around 2016, when I'm at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where actually you and I had first met, I spoke to someone else about factory farms. And now I'm going to return to what you started with, which was that if we eliminated factory farms, we're talking about 95%, say, of all animal products are immediately, say, removed. And I had a conversation with a religious studies professor who said a similar thing. They said, I absolutely would support some kind of illegalization of animal products, but they didn't seem to make them actually change their animal consumption in the present.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's an empirical question. I think that people may say those things because there's no immediate threat of that regulation, but if that regulation were tabled, I think a lot of people might oppose it if they're not willing to change their. And I think there's something there about willingness, right? About willingness and openness to change their consumer habits.
Is there also, not just to interject, is there also not the way in which, say in the smoking example, you had a way in which we could immediately understand that secondhand smoke was endangering other humans' well-being, right? And this was probably the main driver. And there's a stigma about smoking, and also just how awful it is for the individual level, where we don't have as much, in the animal foods case, there seems to be even like this preponderance of things like carnivore diets or keto diets or all this other kind of this mess of studies about nutrition and so on. But that aside, the consequences for humans was immediate, other humans. In this case, the issue is that the consequences, the immediate consequences are for animals, right, who are still regulated as not really having that kind of moral concern. And these massive human impacts, such as climate change, is kind of a little bit more surreal. It's kind of this, this abstract notion of climate change as opposed to this very tangible notion of secondhand smoke going into someone else's lungs, say, who is present. So I guess I'm curious whether that's part of it too, where people might oppose these measures, banning factory farms or banning meat consumption, because it doesn't have that same kind of immediate concern for humans as smoking did.
I mean, I think maybe that's part of it. I also think meat eating is far more socially entrenched, right? Like 95% of Americans eat meat. Smoking never reached quite those numbers. So I think all of these things, I think it's an empirical question, but as I said, my hypothesis is that people who change their own habits would be more likely to support legislation that made everyone else change their habits. And one thing I will say, and we know this from the public health and policy literature, that a lot of policies, I mean, like smoking bans on indoor smoking or smoking within a certain distance of public buildings, but also things like soda bans, also things like the introduction in 2010 of stricter nutritional standards for school lunches in the United States. A lot of these policies that are contentious early because they smack of government overreach, restriction of consumer sovereignty, if you will, the vast majority of these policies are very popular post facto, right? So, like, for instance, taxes on sugary drinks become these flashpoints of political debate, but after the fact, they're actually see wide public support because people think that it's actually good to disincentivize people from consuming sugary drinks that have really bad health outcomes, both for individuals and for public health. People might scoff at government overreach in setting higher nutritional standards, but then we know that, from surveys that 75%, so 3 out of every 4 parents after the fact, support more nutritious standards for school meals. So this is sort of like the paradox, right? That it's really hard to talk about these sorts of policies. It's hard to gather the political will and political support to pass them. But then very often when they're passed, I think smoking bans are among the most popular policies after the fact, right? While highly contentious before the fact. After these policies are passed, I think people sort of accept that they were all along common sense policies once they're the orthodoxy, but before they're the orthodoxy, they're sort of far more politically unpopular. And so I actually think that a lot of these things, I think we're seeing some of this in Europe now around things like ending derogations on nitrogen emissions, for instance, which affects dairy farms and cattle stocking densities. You need politicians who have the guts to pass these sort of regulations. And then once they're passed, you will have very vocal opposition from minorities and affected minorities. But actually, if you can communicate the benefits, the public health benefits, the environmental benefits, the social benefits of these sorts of regulations, you will have large-scale social support and public support for them.
Yeah, I think I read or I saw tweets somewhere not long ago that said something like, the mainstream supports all social justice movements except the one happening right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's like in the past we supported, and hypothetically in the future we also would support it. But the one right now is the hardest, whether it's social justice, environmental justice, food justice. I mean, this is all social
absolutely.
justice.
I mean, I think this is absolutely the case with factory farming. I mean, again, this is a hypothesis, but I mean, I think in that world we talked about earlier, where you wave the magic wand and factory farms go away because of some piece of legislation that bans them, I think a year out from that ban, if you were to run up public opinion surveys, I think a lot of people would say, of course, they should have been banned all along. Factory farms are an abomination. They're sort of like an inhuman abomination. And I can't believe we didn't ban them earlier, right?
Yeah, most people say this. I mean, even people that eat animal products all the time, I know this at least anecdotally, will say, yes, they'll say things like, yeah, future generations will wonder how we allowed this to happen or how we did this. And yet at the moment still might oppose, say, a ban on factory farms. So I think this is the paradox as you described. There is something also we'll touch on. And then, at last, I think I'd like to get in a little bit about the course you'll provide for us. But I also, you said earlier about, the differences between food issues and others is that consumers have a very immediate, routine, daily, socially visible agency. that is absent in other issues. For example, right, I can be, say, for prison abolition, but it's extremely difficult for me to say, like, enact this on a daily level. In many ways, I'd like to find ways, and I mean this not by signing petitions or attending marches, I mean, but in actual my daily practice, it's very challenging for me to do so. But if I could, I would like to live that value, right? And I think many people who say identify as feminists think that they can't just, say, abolish patriarchy and some kind of consumer choice, but in any way where it's possible to live that value, it becomes extremely important. And I think it's essential to separate this from some notion of purity. And that's the issue, is that when it comes to veganism, right, living your values seems to present as a kind of ascetic purity or cleanliness. And of course, this is perhaps part of the fault of vegan messaging itself. But it seems like what you're saying is that in our consumption choices, we can actually live those values. And they are really no different than if we were trying to live, say, feminist values or anti-prison values. Is that kind of the idea, that we have a specific kind of agency that exists in our food consumption?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't draw the direct parallel to other normative political positions necessarily because of the differences that we discussed earlier. But absolutely, I mean, I think with something like food choices, to the extent that people have the capacity to make different choices in terms of the means or the access, then yeah, making different food choices in line with your stated values is something that everyone can do. But I also think that it's important not just as an individual action, but also as a way of norm shifting, right? It's very important to shift norms, and norm shifts start with individual changes. So for instance, the more vegans there are, for instance, the more veganism gets normalized, right? The more veganism is normalized, the more other people will be willing to try veganism or understand what plant-based options are or offer plant-based options, right? Be it at someone's house or at restaurants or in institutional settings. So, and the more those norms shift, the more it's easier to shift markets in terms of what's produced, like what's supplied to feed demand, but also in terms of pushing for policy. But one other thing I'll say is that to the extent we're talking about just individuals in their day-to-day lives, other than their own individual shopping decisions, people can, to the extent they can try to influence institutional buying decisions, right? So if you work at a company and that company doesn't offer plant-based options or doesn't offer plant-based options as, let's say, default at conferences or meetings, that's something that you can raise, right? And we know from the literature on nudges and changing defaults that things like offering more plant-based, just putting more plant-based options on menus leads more people to buy them and try them, especially if they're delicious, right? Making plant-based options the default at settings where people eat food, right? Like be it cafeterias, be it events, be it weddings or whatever, right? People are more likely to stick with the default option rather than opt out of it.
Sure.
To the extent people can push for these sorts of changes, that itself can have an effect, because again, it comes back to shifting norms, which is to say normalizing more plant-based eating, normalizing meat being decentered on the plate. And I think that this is one of the ways that social change happens. And I think a lot of people downplay individual actions. There are a number of reasons for this. And I think that this is sort of grounds for different conversations. But I think one of the reasons is because in a lot of issues, as you mentioned, individual action or individual consumer action seems sort of not up to the task. But in the case of food systems and in the case of meat, as I said, consumers have quite a bit of choice to choose different options, but also to change norms around what eating is, what a good diet is, what a normal diet is.
Not to mention that many of these other issues have actually similarly employed boycotts, right? Consumer interventions in support of their causes, among kind of myriad other options. It's not like they're kind of sole source, but the part is that these actually have typically been across the political spectrum in one way or another. But to speak to your other point, or just kind of say that how I agree, is I think you're right. I think there has been maybe this notion that norm changes. I mean, I think the focus in the animal rights movement in the past few decades has been a lot about shifting cultural norms, right? Creating a new culture that is more conducive to these massive shifts in these deep pillars in our society. And, I was thinking of the example of the difference between, say, having, one vegan person at a dinner table talking about veganism using rational arguments will certainly, at least in my mind, do less to create a cultural shift than if you just had three there living it, right? Making it the norm, making it what people around you do. And I think this is integral to then when people are talking about policy, ballot measures, and societal support.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of to take your example one step further, what if the food, or at least a bunch of the food on that dinner table, is itself vegan? So you can talk about the actual things, rather than discussion being sort of in abstract terms and people feeling like the one option on the table is being critiqued or the other option isn't being presented. What if you have really delicious plant-based food on the table while you're having this conversation, right? As a sort of object lesson in the fact that you can eat healthy, nutritious meals, right? So I'm saying sort of like more vegans around the table, more vegan food on the table is
Exactly.
the way.
I agree. So in the last few minutes, maybe we could shift specifically to the course. So we have a series of courses coming out through 2024, all the way through spring 2025 as part of our Vegan Studies initiative. These courses began with a course on Jainism and veganism and engaged religion taught by myself and Chris Miller. We have a course going on right now, Lucille Stanescu, on greenwashing, humane washing, and Professor Dutkiewicz is providing a course on food systems called Feeding the World Toward a Plant-Based Food System. So for those students who will take this course, and maybe it will be a kind of summary of things we've already spoken about so far, could you at least talk a little bit about what students can expect in terms of content or readings or examples that help understand this issue?
The aim of the course is to provide a sort of holistic overview of what the food system is in the United States, of course, with nods to food systems elsewhere, provide them with an introduction to food systems analysis as a method of understanding what food systems are, who benefits, how, where, how food actually gets on the table from sort of farm to consumer. Then students will be showed how analysis of environmental impacts of food production works, what impacts are measured, where they're measured, what this means in the aggregate for the environmental impact of food systems. We'll do something similar for talking about labor in the food system. We'll talk, of course, in this particular context, about the impacts on animals of this food system. And then we'll talk about options for food system change, be it individual change and norm shifts, be it opportunities for legislation and policy, or be it opportunities for shifting markets through the development of new products. And overall, the aim will be to think about both the potential benefits of a primarily plant-based food system, the limits or the sort of problems not addressed by a shift to plant-based food systems, and then thinking about strategies for getting towards a more plant-based food system.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. I think especially given, I've heard you speak elsewhere and talk about how you're a researcher and you're going where the research takes you, the data takes you. And I think for a lot of people in the community concerned about whether Jains or non-Jains, concerned about nonviolence, non-harming, minimizing the pain and oppression of others and kind of allowing individuals to survive and thrive, it is extremely important to think systemically and have this data on hand, have this information on hand, because it becomes important for individuals, right, to see that this is about all of us, right? It's about creating a more just world that takes everyone into consideration, that commands that consideration, and how do we care for others? And I think that's really hard to, disagree with. Anyone who's not interested in caring for others or supporting the well-being of those on this planet, I don't know how much this course or this content in general would be for them. Which is all to say that I'm definitely looking forward to it myself. For those listening, the course involves Q&A sessions with Professor Dutkiewicz, where we can get even deeper into these questions and clarify some of them. So is there anything else that you'd like to add before we end here?
No, I mean, to the extent I'd love for them to sign up for the course. If people want to shoot me an email beforehand to ask questions, I'm happy to do that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Great. So thank you so much for joining us on the Engaged Jain Studies podcasts. No matter how many conversations we've had, kind of on the record, off the record, I'm always learning so much, and I'm super excited about the work that you've done and continue to do. I'm even more excited that our students will be exposed to your research and your insights. So thank you all for joining the podcast today, and we hope to see you in our next episode.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.